You are entering Nick and Mello's hyperspace.
Hello, I'm Carmelo, and my favorite Star Wars Rebels characters are the Loth Wolves.
And I'm Nick, and my favorite character is Kanan Jarrus, aka Caleb Doom.
In our journey through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one old, who came together through the will of the Force.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about something near and dear to our hearts, Star Wars Rebels, the animated series that went from 2014 to 2018 on Disney XD. You and I have talked so much about this show offline that it's probably one of our favorite things in all of Star Wars.
It really is, and it's very interesting because it's the first visual thing that we get from Disney after the purchase. And so it's sort of our first introduction to this sort of shift that happens with sort of Star Wars production. And, like everything in television, you sort of slowly grow to it. But I really love the look of it. And I love the characters that it creates. And I love the storylines that it produces from everything that we knew, both from the movies and from the animated Clone Wars that Dave Filoni supervised starting in 2008. It sort of picks up, I'm going to call it the baggage of Star Wars, but then it sort of takes it into some beautiful things, just beautiful realms that I find really interesting.
Yeah, you mentioned it came off the heels of the Disney acquisition of Star Wars, and it was in a weird time because we didn't really know. We knew movies were coming, but we didn't really know what else was going to be happening. And Disney, this was kind of their introduction, and in a lot of ways, I kind of think of it as a parallel to The Force Awakens. It's set in a familiar time frame in an era that we're all familiar with: Empire versus Rebels, and this galaxy where this evil government is just ruthless and controlling all these systems, and it's basically bread and butter Star Wars. It came off the heels of a beloved show being canceled, and so I guess in that sense, there's a lot of a segment of the fan that was kind of maybe resentful or pushed this show aside because of that. Such a beloved show, and something that also had a weird following at first. It was kind of took a second to get off the ground, and then I think Rebels kind of had a similar structure the way it went. It took a minute to get off the ground before it became beloved.
And you have a very good point that part of the problem with Rebels is that it wasn't a substitute to Clone Wars. Clone Wars gets cut off, and then the next animated show is Rebels. And so a lot of people were sort of expecting a Clone Wars-y kind of show. And this is a very different show. And so it required a little bit of shifting gears for many of the people that were following animated Star Wars. I mean, there were people that were not even watching the animated Star Wars, so they didn't watch Rebels either. It's been very interesting that now that Ahsoka showed up in The Mandalorian, there are all these people that are finally watching Rebels, who were people who were only doing live action Star Wars, and that's all they watched. And now that we have a live action television show and Ahsoka shows up, everybody's like, and who is this woman? And so it's been really interesting. I've seen all over online, all these people like, I'm watching Rebels for the first time. And they're watching Clone Wars as well. But we're talking about Rebels today.
Right.
So we're focusing on that today.
I think in a lot of ways you can't really talk about one without the other. They're kind of, they go hand in hand a little bit, and a lot of the characters and
they do
storylines get brought over into Rebels, but
I think them as different shows. The mood of Clone Wars is very different from Rebels for me. It's not only the visual style, but also sort of, the Clone Wars are this very important historical period in the galaxy, and Rebels is, we finally get to see visually, we've seen it in the novels before, visually what happens before Episode 4, before A New Hope. And so it's interesting to get a period that we knew about, that it had shown up in some of the fiction, but we had not seen it in, I'm going to call it screen Star Wars, television or film. in screen Star Wars, we had not seen it before. So it's sort of fun to see that new, what does it mean to live in the Empire, and what does it mean to slowly join the rebellion,
Right.
which we expected it would happen, but we had never seen it. So it was fun to see it in that show. In our conversations, Nick, you had talked about something that everybody talks about in the movies, and it's this whole notion of the hero's journey. And you had mentioned that you had a whole bunch of ideas about using this sort of mythological narrative trope and how it applies to Rebels. So I would love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so if you follow any sci-fi or fantasy, usually they follow a blueprint, the hero's journey, which is a young character gets called to action and with a mentor and goes on a journey to become a hero. And Rebels is kind of like, I always think of it as like a mini story within a much larger story, because we follow one group of characters, but a lot of they don't really cross over very much with the film characters. We see them occasionally, but it's not very. I guess it's inconsequential to what plays out in the rest of the films. So these characters, we find them very young. Ezra Miller, or I'm sorry, Ezra Bridger, not the actor. Forgive me. Not him. Sorry, not him.
We're not editing that out.
Sorry. We got a lot of DC on my mind. So anyway, we find him, and he's very similar to Luke Skywalker. He's on a planet that he's stuck on, and he's kind of more wanting to be. He's more about himself than the larger picture, the larger world outside his windows, you will. And we not only follow his journey, but we get to follow other characters' journeys. The main cast of Kanan and Hera and Sabine and Zeb, they all have a different
journey.
reason for doing what they're doing, and they're kind of like a Robin Hood gang when we first meet them. They take from the Empire and help out the little guys, and but they all have a reason for fighting against the Empire, whether that be for their people being oppressed and even eradicated in Zeb's case. Kanan, obviously, with his connection as a former Jedi, and him being basically public enemy number one. We get to see them fight through personal demons and reliving that trauma that brought them to where they are, and they have to kind of I think that's the good part about any kind of hero's journey. We have to see our main characters face the unthinkable, the things that they don't want to think about, the things they don't want to overcome, the things that they just want to bury inside of them.
I really had not thought about this until now when you're explaining this. I'm going to put my humanities professor hat on for a second. In the West, a lot of the hero's journey focuses on one individual that travels through all of these struggles and conflicts and passages and all of these things. There's a wonderful Chinese novel called Journey to the West about the monkey. And one of the really marvelous things about this book is that you don't really have a protagonist. You have four. The journey is four characters that are going to the West, which is India in the novel, to get all the Buddhist scriptures and bring them back to China, to bring Buddhism to China. That's basically the story. Rebels, in a way, Ezra is the protagonist, but when we're looking at the journey, it's the story of Hera, and it's the journey of Hera, it's the journey of Kanan, it's the journey of Sabine. In a way, it's the journey of Zeb and the journey of Ezra. And so it's really unique and fun to have a story in which you have multiple journeys happening at the same time, rather than the journey of one person in which all of these people are helping. And so I have just discovered in the middle of this podcast yet another reason to love Rebels. That is not simply Ezra going through the journey and all these people helping around, but are all these multiple journeys happening for multiple reasons in different contexts, with different struggles, with different conflicts, with different enemies, as we go through the 4 seasons of the show. And it's sort of fun to discover something by just listening to you, and all of a sudden it's like, yes, that's yet another thing.
That's the great thing about, different perspectives. We think about things that we obviously didn't think
that
about.
We had not. Right.
Yeah. And another thing you mentioned, that each character has their own little their hero's journey. But we, in the beginning, it seems like a stereotypical children's show where we see young kid, older mentor taking him under his wing, and then we have the mother figure, and then we have Sabine, who's more like the annoying little sister or older sister, and then Zeb's kind of like the fun uncle, or and then we really don't think much about Zeb. We think he's more of a comedic, fun character until we get more of his story.
Right?
Yeah, and I think that happens with all of them. We think of them as a stereotypical character until we learn more about why the way they are, and they do it so naturally. It feels natural to me that it's just we kind of learn it piece by piece, and then we get to see it just play out wonderfully.
And to me, that is part of my attraction to television, that by having these episodic moments through a long period of time, rather than a 2-hour or a 3-hour movie at the movies or on your phone, wherever you're watching it, that you get to have multiple narrative lines. You can't do that in a 3-hour movie. You just can't.
Right. That's hard.
But on television, it lends itself to have all these multiple journeys happening at the same time. And it's one of the things that I find very, very attractive about Rebels. Now, can you, I am curious about the idea of the mentor that you were talking about, because one of the things that I find interesting in Rebels is that Ezra gets different mentors throughout the show.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, Kanan is the principal one, but Hera is a mentor of sorts. Ahsoka is a mentor of sorts later on. Even the Loth Wolves are mentors of sorts, of sort of helping or telling or sort of mentoring what he needs to do and what he should be doing, even if they don't speak. When Kanan turns into Doom, that's a different story. But it's really interesting that it's not one mentor, but that he gets a series of mentors throughout the show. And I don't know that I have anything intelligent to say about it, but I just find it really interesting.
Well, I would say too, 2 other characters that I guess maybe on a smaller scale that are sort of his mentors for times is Maul and even Hondo, I would say.
Oh God, yes. God, yes. You're right. So now we're talking about 6 of them.
Right. And I think each play an important role in his development as the story goes on. At the time when Maul kind of becomes his mentor, it's in a dark. It's a very dark time for him. He's kind of questioning his place and his place in his story, and of course, Maul is very manipulative, very step forward like, and then Hondo, he kind of is more of I wouldn't say he's the same scale as Maul, but he does present the more of the smuggler, scoundrel type of, do look out for yourself and don't worry about these other people, because what can they give you? And I think that's part of the teachings of the Jedi. Is you have to ignore those urges and those desires and be selfless as possible. And I think each one, like I said, play a different role in that development. I think even though at the end Hondo does help them, I think Ezra is at the point in maturity where he realizes that's not correct. Like, that's not what a Jedi is supposed to be, or just a good person, I guess.
Yep. And let's not forget that Ezra starts as a petty thief when we first meet him. Right. He's just looking out for himself and trying to survive in the streets of Lothal. And so it's that connection with Hondo is a very natural one for the young kid. But as you say, he sort of grows out of Hondo and he moves on. Thank you for mentioning Maul, because to me, Ezra is To me, he is one of those really fascinating moments in Star Wars in which the notion of the dark side and the notion of the light are not seen as necessarily good versus bad.
Mm-hmm.
The beginning of season 3, Ezra is a character that is toying with the idea of not thinking of these as polar opposites, but thinking as all of it is part of the Force.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a morally complicated issue, but I find it so interesting that they went there. I really liked it that they went there. I remember my perking up in my chair in my sofa thinking, oh my goodness, they're going to do this? And that beginning of the first episode of season 3 is sort of that moment where Ezra stops thinking for a moment, not about the dark side and the light, but about the Force.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of thinking about it as this sort of whole. I'm going to sound like an old man now, but it is very much sort of a young person's notion of sort of like, we have a goal, we need to get there. I don't care how we get there, we need to get there. And so in a way, it's very sort of characteristic of somebody of Ezra's age. But I just find it really interesting that for so much of screen Star Wars, in the novels is different. But so much of screen Star Wars is very much about this sort of polar opposites, that
Right.
the dark and the light are always as opposing terms. There's a dichotomy of the light and the dark. And Ezra sort of says, no, I'm going to, no. It's like, no, we're not doing this, which is, typical adolescent, but a typical smart adolescent that is sort of has sort of understood this polar opposite has its issues.
I'd also say too that not just Ezra, I think we get a lot of lore and mythology built into the show when it comes to the Force and the teachings of Jedi and Sith, and Ahsoka and Kanan are survivors of a great purge and a war that really just changed the galaxy forever. And we get to see them kind of facing their demons when it comes to regrets and rethinking of, am I doing the right thing, or even that favorite line. It really, I can't remember what episode it was, honestly, I'm blanking, but I remember a line when it might have been the beginning of season 2 when Hera and Kanan are talking about joining the much larger rebellion. He says that, we were just doing this as a way to help out the little guys, and this is, military, this is more organized, more of a war. And she's like, and what's wrong with that? That's going to help more people. But the line that just stuck out to me, and it really made me take the show seriously, was he's like, well, I've already survived one war. I don't want to do this again. And we see, and I think this is why Kanan has just become one of my favorite characters. His journey of really examining the past and overcoming mistakes, even if they weren't his fault, and becoming the mentor that he never really got to have or got to experience for Ezra, was really satisfying. We get to see him kind of heal himself and become the Jedi that he was supposed to be, that unfortunately got taken away from him. It was a different path than what he probably would have taken. But like Yoda says, that Jedi will always face the darkness. They will always. There's never a day that it just. There's no easy days. It's a continuous battle with yourself, and I think that's just very interesting when we look at that. From our world, we do this every day. We always have to make decisions, whether it's doing the right thing or thinking about the others around us. We have to do the right thing, and human nature, we are always tempted by the easy, quick way out, and obviously that's always not the best.
And it's interesting as I'm listening to you, I'm sort of realizing that every single main character in Rebels is a survivor of some sort. These are all people who have gone through a critical time in their lives, and they're just trying to survive. And the show is about making that survival mode into something that sort of helps the larger galaxy rather than just themselves. And you're right. I think that's at the beginning. What you said about Kanan, that's the very beginning of season 2. It's in one of the first 2 episodes, because the arc is 2 episodes, the beginning, and it's in one of the 2. I don't remember where. It's in my book. It's in my book. I remember I put it somewhere in my book because it is a very important, it's in the section of the Jedi in my book. And it's a very important moment in there. I wanted to point out, some sort of moving on a little bit, that another thing that is really interesting about Rebels is that it sort of picks up different forms of Star Wars and sort of runs with it. Rebels is where Thrawn shows up for the first time in visual Star Wars, and in sort of moving Star Wars. He had been in comics, but this is the first time that we see him in on television. He's never been in film, on television, and so we get things that began in fiction and move on to Rebels. Ahsoka comes from Clone Wars and moves on to Rebel. Leia has an appearance that's coming from the original trilogy, and it comes onto Rebels. Darth Maul is from the prequel trilogy, and it comes onto Rebels. So it's really wonderful how they're picking up all these different lines from these different formats of Star Wars and bringing them into the show, and then they sort of then they spread out to other things later. And so now we know that Thrawn is going to be in the Ahsoka show later. Leia, of course, shows up in the sequel trilogy after Rebels has come out. Maul even shows up in Solo, and so there's this. Rebels is sort of like this little funnel where they pick up all these Star Wars things and then whoop, they spread them out onto it. And so it's a really fun, it's almost like a bridge that takes you to sort of the next layer, the next step, the next phase, if you want to use Marvel comics, Marvel stories, language to what comes after. And I love that. It's really, really fun. I mean, I met Thrawn first in cartoons, and then I started reading the novels. So my introduction to Thrawn was him on television, and then I started reading the novels. So it was fun seeing him there, and then going back and reading on the Legends novels, and then the new series of novels that are coming out. So that's another really fun thing about Rebels there.
Yeah, it does a really good job. And you would think it seemed at first, I remember R2 and 3PO have an episode. I think Lando has an episode. And we see that it kind of like the first season, I guess it's more of a way for them to get the more maybe traditional, or no offense, older fans on board of the series, and try to kind of ease them into this story with all these new characters that we've never met before. And they do a really good job of not letting those characters overshadow the main characters of the series. It's fun to see them and see where they are in their journeys, and but they don't completely take over the show. I don't feel like we do get a large part of Maul and kind of a conclusion to his story, but it doesn't dominate. Well, I guess not the whole season. We get a couple of episodes to wrap him up and send him off, and same with Thrawn. He eventually becomes the overarching villain of the series, but he doesn't detract from Ezra's story or Kanan's or anyone else's. He just seemingly fits in perfectly. It's really cool how they did that.
The way that Maul gets inserted into the story, I think is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I just love that. The episode with Leia is so much fun. I think it's a really fun little episode, and it's a very Leia episode, which I really quite enjoy very much.
Same with the Lando episode. That's a fun one because Billy D. Williams comes back and does the voice, and it's awesome. Right. It's really cool, and we get to see him a little bit before we finally meet him in the original trilogy. And he's just typical Lando, trying to do what's good for him, and always be a smooth talker. And yeah, it's just fun. I love those episodes.
It's interesting that we had when we structure our podcast, we wanted to talk about the sort of the kiddie notion of the show, but we've been talking about this notion. But I think it would be fun to sort of wrap up to talk a little bit more about this sort of assumption that this show is only for children.
Yeah.
And part of our sort of prejudice or misconception or idea that Star Wars is now owned by Disney, therefore it's going to be very kiddie oriented. I think in a way Rebels proves that yes, children are still part of the audience,
Right.
but it is a story that that adds audiences as the show moves along. And in many ways, I feel that Rebels, in a way, proves, in a similar way that Clone Wars does towards the end, especially season 4 and season 5, and then the other ones, that animation is not really only for children, and that animated Star Wars is something that is a different format with different rules and different sort of stylistic decisions, but you can still have fans crying their eyes out at the end of season 4 with the story of Kanan at the end. It's just there's something really beautiful and really moving and very compelling about Star Wars. Even the story of Ezra in the last 3 or 4 episodes of season 4 are really quite moving. And so this is not the Teletubbies, let me tell you.
Right. This is not for preschoolers.
And so this is infinitely more complex. And I'm really glad about it. It's just I've seen Rebels 7 times, the whole thing.
Wow.
7 times, and I am ready to watch it again.
And I think our society has gotten better about being accepting of Star Wars, Marvel, all these things being for everyone, not just for children. Obviously, with the success of the Marvel films, we've seen that plenty of people can enjoy these movies, and
Right.
I think it's a good example because there's a different example because we do have the Star Wars films still, and we still have more coming, and even TV series, live action ones. And then Rebels and Clone Wars, and to an extent, they still kind of get looked at as for children. So when you do see references to these series and these stories and other things, the general people that don't watch these shows like you and I, they kind of brush them aside as, oh, that happened in a cartoon. That must not be that relevant,
Mm-hmm.
And sadly, I think there are always going to be a segment of people that just kind of always feel that way. But I think like I mentioned earlier, that the show is very deep. I think deeper than I originally anticipated. It has a lot of underlying themes that fit with Star Wars and just relatable to any age. Of course, there's some funny, goofy scenes with Ezra and Zeb picking at each other like brothers, and but you're going to get a very personal story about a man overcoming his demons and trying to be a father figure or a mentor that he never had or never got to experience, or a young girl who got used and helped eradicate her people, and it was a moving part for her to overcome that.
Right.
And it's I think all these themes and all these characters have something that we can relate to, something that we can gravitate to. And I think that's really not just this show, but Star Wars in general. That's what's really universally loved about it. I think it's not like the things are cool. Like we love lightsabers, we love space battles, but these
and those are there, and those are fun.
They're
and those
still
are
there. They're still there, but
I refuse to put down battleships and explosions. I love that stuff. But it's really fun when when it's more than just that. When it's more than just that.
Yeah.
And as you say, there's people that sort of have dismissed animated Star Wars as something. This is not part of the real Star Wars. It's really interesting. I'm having the same conversations with the High Republic novels. Like some people are saying, "Oh, I'm only reading the adult novels. I'm not going to read the junior novels." And I'm like, "You're missing some amazing stuff."
Cool stuff.
And so it's really interesting how sort of the assumptions that we have about these categories of genres, about what a movie is versus what a television show is versus what a animated television show is. We have created a hierarchy about it. And I'm hoping that this podcast today will sort of make some people rethink about these hierarchies, because I think the hierarchies are simply different modes, but they're not age limiting.
Right.
All right, guys, we need to stop.
Yeah, we could do this all day.
We could
for
do this all
hours.
day, but we're not doing a 7-hour podcast on Rebels because then nobody will watch.
We don't want to take up. Yeah, we don't want to take up everyone's time like that.
We'll keep it.
Is
tight.
there anything? I guess. Is there anything else you want to just say about Rebels before we wrap it up?
I got my list. I got everything that I put in my notes is right here. So I think we shouldn't bore our audiences anymore, so they can watch the rest. So
I just want to say though that if you have any hesitations about not just Rebels but any animated Star Wars, I think you would be, if you're a fan of Star Wars and you love the themes and the messages that it provides. I think Rebels and Clone Wars and all these animated series, I think they do a really good job of keeping it consistent, and I think you would do yourself a good service just to give them a try. I mean, you don't have to love them obviously, but just give it a try. I think it's cool. They're really awesome.
And watched, and yes, I'm just going to say yes. I agree. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you, sir.
May the force be with everybody, and we'll see you at the next one.